They laughed first, not because it was funny, but because they were certain they were right. In that room, power had a voice. It wasn't hers. But what they didn't know was that this moment would be the last time anyone laughed. This is one of those stories. This is what happened when they went silent. They laughed first, not because anyone had told a joke, but because laughter was easier than listening. The classroom was old, the kind where the walls still carried the faint smell of chalk and dust, even though whiteboards had replaced blackboards years ago. Posters about dreaming big and believing in yourself peeled slightly at the corners, like promises no one checked on anymore. At the back of the room sat Eli Carter, 12 years old, shoulders slightly hunched, hands folded neatly on top of a notebook that had been erased and reused too many times. His shoes were clean, but worn thin at the soles. His backpack zipper didn't close all the way. Eli had learned early on how to take up as little space as possible. At the front of the room stood Mr. Harlan, a man who had been teaching history for over 20 years and made sure everyone knew it. He liked order, he liked certainty, and above all, he liked being right. So, Mr. Harlan said, scanning the room with a tight smile, "We're doing something different today." A few students straightened in their seats. Others barely looked up from their phones. "I asked each of you to write down what you want to be when you grow up," he continued. "Not what sounds nice, but you actually believe you can become." That last sentence landed heavier than the first. Mr. Harlan began calling names, one by one. Doctor, engineer, lawyer. Each answer earned a nod, sometimes a comment. Approval came easily to some. Then his eyes fell on the last paper in his hand. Eli Carter, he read aloud. Eli felt his stomach tighten. He stood, slowly, the metal legs of his chair scraping softly against the floor. "Yes, sir?" Mr. Harlan adjusted his glasses and looked at the paper again, just to be sure. "You wrote," he paused. Then he chuckled. "You wrote military strategist." The room stirred. A few students exchanged looks. Someone near the window snorted. "A military strategist," Mr. Harlan repeated, louder this time. "Do you even know what that is, son?" Eli swallowed. "Yes, sir." "And where exactly did you get that idea?" Mr. Harlan asked. "From a video game." Laughter rippled through the room now. Not loud, not cruel, just enough to sting. Eli felt his face warm, but he didn't sit down. "My dad talks about strategy," he said quietly. "Okay?" He says, "Wars aren't just about fighting, okay? They're about decisions." That only seemed to amuse Mr. Harlan more. "Your dad," he said, nodding slowly. "And what does your father do, Eli?" Eli hesitated. "Just for a second. He's in the army," he answered. The laughter returned, sharper this time. Mr. Harlan raised a hand, pretending to calm the room while enjoying every second of it. "In the army," he repeated. "It's nice. But let me explain something to you." He stepped away from the desk, pacing now. "Military strategists don't come from nowhere. They're trained at the highest levels, elite academies, years of education, connections." He stopped and looked directly at Eli. "Not dreams written in a notebook." The room went quiet, but not in a good way. "This isn't about discouraging you," Mr. Harlan added, his tone falsely gentle. "It's about being realistic. You should aim for something achievable." Eli stood there, hands clenched at his sides. "What's achievable for someone like you," Mr. Harlan continued, "is learning discipline, following instructions, supporting roles, okay?" The words settled over Eli like a label. Mr. Harlan turned back to the desk. "You may sit." Eli sat down slowly, his ears ringing. Round him, students avoided his eyes. Some looked embarrassed, others looked relieved it wasn't them. On the wall, a poster read, "Your future starts here." Eli stared at it, expression unreadable. Because what Mr. Harlan didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the story they thought they understood had only just begun, and that the certainty filling the classroom would not last. Eli didn't speak for the rest of the class. He copied notes from the board, word for word, even when he already knew them. Dates, battles, names of generals whose faces stared out from textbook pages like distant legends. Men whose decisions had shaped nations, whose strategies were studied centuries later. Mr. Harlan moved on as if nothing had happened, but something had shifted. During group work, Eli was assigned to the corner table with two boys who spoke only to each other. When he offered an idea, they nodded politely and ignored it. At lunch, his usual seat was taken, and no one made room. None of it was dramatic enough to complain about. That was the worst part. After school, Eli walked home alone, the strap of his backpack cutting into his shoulder. His neighborhood sat at the edge of town, where sidewalks cracked and streetlights flickered on too early. He passed the same abandoned lot where weeds grew taller than fences. The apartment was quiet. His father hadn't returned yet. Eli dropped his backpack by the door and pulled a folded sheet of paper from the side pocket. It was creased, worn thin from being unfolded and refolded too many times. On it were hand-drawn diagrams, arrows, symbols, notes, written in careful, tight handwriting. They were maps. Not real ones, not exactly, but imagined scenarios. If troops moved here, if supply lines broke there, if the weather changed, if timing failed. His father never laughed at them. That evening, Eli sat at a small kitchen table, rewriting one of the scenarios, refining it. He didn't notice the time until the door finally opened. His father stepped inside quietly, uniform still pressed, boots dusty. He looked tired in the way only people who carried responsibility learned to hide. "Hey," he said softly. Eli looked up. "Hey, Dad." His father set his cap down and noticed the papers immediately. He didn't ask. He never did. "Rough day?" he asked. Eli shrugged. "Just school." His father nodded, accepting the half-truth. The next morning, things didn't improve. Mr. Harlan returned, graded assignments, and paused briefly at Eli's desk. The paper was marked with a red B+. "Good effort," he said flatly, loud enough for others to hear. But effort doesn't replace aptitude. A few students glanced over. Eli said nothing. Later that week, the principal announced a special assembly, a guest speaker, a local hero, as the email described it. Someone who would inspire realistic career goals. The phrase made Eli's stomach tighten. On the day of the assembly, the gym filled with folding chairs and restless energy. Teachers stood along the walls, arms crossed, eyes scanning. Mr. Harlan sat in the front row, posture proud. Eli sat near the back. The principal stepped up to the microphone and smiled too widely. "Today, we're honored to welcome a distinguished guest," she said. "Someone who has served this country with dedication and leadership." Eli's head lifted slightly. "Please welcome," she continued, "Colonel James Whitaker." Applause broke out as a man in uniform walked onto the stage. He moved with confidence, his posture sharp, his presence commanding without trying. Eli watched closely. The colonel spoke about discipline, about teamwork, about knowing your place within a system. He spoke well, carefully, like someone used to choosing words that mattered. Then came questions. Hands shot up. "What's it like, being in charge? Is it scary? Did you always want to be in the army?" The colonel answered patiently. Then, unexpectedly, the microphone reached Eli's row. The student beside him froze. Eli hesitated, then raised his hand. The gym quieted slightly. "Yes," the colonel said, gesturing to him. Eli stood. "Sir," he began, voice steady despite the weight pressing on his chest. "How do you decide when not to follow orders?" A murmur spread. Mr. Harlan turned in his seat. The colonel studied Eli for a long moment before answering. "That's a thoughtful question," he said slowly. Sometimes leadership means understanding the intent behind an order and knowing when the situation has changed. Kay paused. Why do you ask? Eli opened his mouth, then closed it. I just wanted to know, he said. The colonel nodded, eyes still on him. Keep asking questions like that. The assembly ended soon after. A student spowed out. Mr. Harlan shook his head, amused. Careful, Eli, he said lightly as the boy passed. Questions like that get people into trouble. Eli didn't respond. What Mr. Harlan didn't notice was the way the colonel had watched the boy leave the gym, or the way his expression had changed, just slightly. It's like something familiar had resurfaced. The change didn't happen loudly. There was no announcement, no warning. It started with a knock on the classroom door 3 days after the assembly. Mr. Harlan was midway through a lecture on 20th century conflicts, chalk tapping the board in practiced rhythm, when the sound interrupted him. He frowned, annoyed at the break in momentum. Yes, he called. The door opened, and the principal stepped in, her expression unusually tight. Mr. Harlan, she said, lowering her voice, I need you for a moment. A collective groan rippled through the room. Mr. Harlan sighed, set the chalk down, and followed her into the hallway. The door closed. Inside the classroom, the noise returned. Whispers, shifting chairs, a few quiet laughs. Eli remained still, eyes on his notebook. Minutes passed, longer than usual. When the door finally opened again, Mr. Harlan stepped back inside, but something was different. His confident stride had shortened. His face had lost its color. Behind him stood the principal, and beside her, the colonel. Colonel Whitaker scanned the room once, slowly. His gaze moved from desk to desk, then stopped. On Eli, the room went quiet without anyone being told to. Class, the principal said, clearing her throat. We're going to pause today's lesson. Mr. Harlan said nothing. The colonel stepped forward. I'd like to ask a question, he said calmly. No one spoke. He nodded toward Eli. You, please stand. Eli felt every eye turn toward him. He stood, heart pounding, unsure why his legs felt so heavy. Do you recognize me? The colonel asked. Yes, sir, Eli replied. From the assembly. The colonel's lips curved slightly. He turned to Mr. Harlan. Do you remember the student? Mr. Harlan straightened. Of course, he said quickly. Eli Carter. And what did he say he wanted to become? The colonel asked. Mr. Harlan hesitated, just a fraction of a second. He expressed interest in military strategy, he said. Though I explained the importance of realism. The colonel nodded slowly, as if considering that. Realism, he repeated. He reached into the folder, tucked under his arm, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. Yesterday, he said, I reviewed a set of strategic simulations submitted anonymously to a regional youth program. Mr. Harlan frowned. I'm not sure I follow. They were unsigned, the colonel continued, unbothered. But the approach was distinctive. He turned the paper so the class could see the projected image the principal was now pulling up on the screen. Lines, arrows, conditional movements. An adaptive response to failure points. Eli's breath caught. It was his. The scenario, the colonel said, involved limited resources, unpredictable opposition, and civilian risk. The solution prioritized containment over force. That's uncommon, whispers started. Mr. Harlan shifted his weight. Sir, with respect, students often find materials online. I thought that too, the colonel said evenly, till I tested it. He tapped the folder. I changed the variables 3 times. He looked back at Eli. Each revision improved. Silence settled over the room, the heavy kind. Eli, the colonel asked, did you create this? Eli swallowed. Yes, sir. A student near the window whispered, no way. The colonel nodded once, satisfied. Then he turned to Mr. Harlan. I'd like to know, he said, what criteria you use to determine who should be encouraged and who should be corrected. Mr. Harlan opened his mouth. closed it. He cleared his throat. I encourage students to be practical. Practical, the colonel echoed, by dismissing capability before understanding it. Mr. Harlan's ears reddened. Colonel gestured to the screen. This level of strategic thinking isn't taught at this school. The principal looked at Mr. Harlan now. Swear, the colonel continued. Do you think it came from? No one laughed. No one moved. Eli stood there, unsure whether to sit, unsure whether this was real. The colonel's voice softened slightly. Your father, he said, trained under me. The room seemed to tilt. He speaks highly of you, the colonel added. Often, Mr. Harlan stared at Eli as if seeing him for the first time, not as a student, as a mistake. The colonel closed the folder. This conversation isn't over, he said, but it will continue, differently. He nodded once to Eli. You may sit. Eli sat down, hands trembling. Around him, no one spoke, 'cause the room had finally understood something it should have questioned from the start, and for the first time since Eli had stood up days ago. No one laughed. The colonel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The weight of the room had already done the work for him. Mr. Harlan stood near the desk, hands clasped behind his back, posture stiff in a way that no longer read as confident. The chalk still rested on the tray, untouched, as if the lesson itself had been abandoned. The principal cleared her throat again. Class, she said carefully, you're dismissed early. Please return to your homerooms. No one moved at first. Then chairs scraped softly against the floor as students stood, filing out in silence. Eyes lingered on Eli, not with laughter now, but with uncertainty. A few nodded at him, small, awkward gestures of acknowledgement. Eli kept his gaze forward. When the room was nearly empty, the principal closed the door behind the last student. Only 4 people remained: Eli, Mr. Harlan, the principal, and the colonel. Mr. Harlan exhaled slowly, as if bracing himself. Sir, he began. If I may explain. The colonel raised a hand, not sharply, but firmly. Explanations come later, he said. First comes understanding. He turned to Eli. Would you mind waiting outside for a moment? Eli nodded and stepped into the hallway. The door closed behind him, muffling the voices inside. He leaned against the cool lockers, heart still racing. Through the door, fragments of conversation drifted out, pattern of discouragement, assumptions, responsibility. Eli stared at the floor, focusing on the scuffed tile until the door opened again. The colonel stepped out. Eli, he said, lowering his voice, you did nothing wrong. Eli nodded, though the words felt heavier than comfort. I want you to know, the colonel continued, that questioning authority is not a flaw. It's a skill. One that needs guidance, not suppression. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a card. Simple, white, no embellishment. Your father knows how to reach me, he said. But this is for you. Eli took the card carefully, as if it might disappear. Thank you, sir, he said. The colonel nodded once, then returned to the classroom. Inside, Mr. Harlan sat now, rather than stood. His shoulders had slumped, the certainty that once filled him replaced by something closer to regret. I didn't think, he began again. That, the colonel said quietly, is the problem. The principal folded her hands. We've received similar concerns before, she admitted. Not formal complaints, just patterns. Mr. Harlan looked up, startled. Patterns. Students you've discouraged, she said. Careers you've dismissed. Mr. Harlan looked down at his hands. The colonel didn't accuse, he didn't threaten. He simply asked questions. Why did you laugh? Why did you decide what was possible? Why didn't you ask him to explain? Each question landed softly and cut deeply. Mr. Harlan swallowed. I thought I was preparing them for reality. The colonel shook his head. Cool, you were preparing them for limitation. Silence filled the room again. Later that week, changes began quietly. Mr. Harlan no longer called on Eli to correct him, but he listened when Eli spoke. When assignments were discussed, he asked questions instead of delivering verdicts. The laughter never returned. At home, Eli showed the card to his father. His father stared at it for a long moment, then looked at his son. Really looked at him. "He saw you," his father said simply. Eli nodded. "It's what matters now," his father added, "is what you do with that." At school, rumors spread, softened by time and distance. The story grew and shifted, as stories always do. But one detail remained unchanged. The day Mr. Harlan had laughed, and the day he stopped. The story didn't end in that classroom. It never does. Weeks passed, and the moment slowly faded from daily conversation, but its effects remained quiet, persistent, undeniable. Eli was no longer invisible. That didn't mean he became loud or confident overnight. He still sat toward the back of the room, still kept his notes neat and his questions measured. But when he spoke now, people listened, not because they were told to, because they had learned. Mr. Harlan changed, too. He stopped pacing when he lectured, stopped assuming silence meant understanding. He began asking students why they thought something would happen, instead of telling them what was supposed to. Sometimes, when Eli raised his hand, Mr. Harlan hesitated, just briefly before calling on him, not out of doubt, out of care. One afternoon, the school announced a new elective program, Strategic Thinking and Leadership. It was framed as a pilot, temporary, experimental, but Eli recognized the structure immediately. Scenario analysis, decision trees, ethical trade-offs. It was his world, finally given a name. He enrolled without hesitation. The first day of the program, only 6 students showed up. Eli was the youngest. The instructor didn't lecture. He posed problems. What do you do when all options cost something? What matters more, speed or certainty? When does restraint become weakness? Eli didn't answer first. He listened. And when he did speak, the room leaned in. At home, the folded papers disappeared from the kitchen drawer. They were replaced by a binder, clean, organized, labeled. His father never said, "I told you so," never needed to. Instead, some evenings, they sat together at the table, quietly adjusting scenarios, changing variables, testing outcomes. Not as teacher and student, as equals. Months later, an envelope arrived in the mail, thick, official. Inside was an invitation to a youth strategic symposium, regional, selective, competitive. At the bottom of the letter was a signature Eli recognized, Colonel James Whitaker. The day Eli left for the symposium, he passed the same abandoned lot, the same cracked sidewalk, the same flickering streetlight. But it felt different now. Not because the world had changed, because he understood how it could. On the final day of school, Mr. Harlan returned the last assignment of the year. On Eli's paper, in red ink, was a simple note. Never stop asking the questions others are afraid to. Eli folded the paper carefully and placed it in his backpack. Years later, when people told the story, because stories like this always get told, they focused on the moment that mattered most to them. Some talked about the colonel walking into the classroom. Some talked about the screen lighting up. Some talked about the laughter stopping. But Eli remembered something else. He remembered the silence after. The silence where no one rushed to speak. The silence where assumptions collapsed. The silence where truth didn't need volume. That was the moment everything changed. Not when he was seen, but when everyone else finally stopped pretending they knew who he was. 'Cause silence, he learned, isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's respect.